All right, as people are trickling in, I will begin by welcoming everyone to the Community Mental Health Drug and Alcohol Research Network's webinar today. And today we're focusing on using program logic in research and evaluation. So if you've not yet met me, my name is Katie Sam, and I'm the project coordinator for CMHDARN. And I will begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands of which we are all variously meeting. Today, I'm situated on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander participants here today. So thank you very much for joining us today. There's been really great interest in today's webinar, and I hope everyone walks away with a better understanding of how you can develop and utilise program logic models in the context of research and evaluation. So if you're new here, the Community Mental Health Drug and Alcohol Research Network is a partnership project between Mental Health Coordinating Council, the Network of Alcohol and Other Drug Agencies, and the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales. So CMHDARN was established to broaden the involvement of community mental health and alcohol and other drug sector in practice-based research, and to promote the value of research and the use of research evidence in practice. So if you're not already a member, I'll pop in the chat how to freely join so you continue to hear about helpful events such as the one today. And before I hand over the reins to the wonderful Jo Farmer, I encourage you all to please use the Q&A function or the chat function throughout the session, as Jo's really eager to answer all of your questions and engage with you throughout the session. So please don't be shy. We are due to finish at 3 o'clock today, and this webinar is being recorded for you to access later if you're unable to stay for the whole event, or if you think that someone in your network would really benefit from being part of this. So I'm delighted now to introduce you to our fantastic presenter for today, Jo Farmer. So Jo is an independent evaluator and advocate working in mental health and trauma sectors. As well as delivering evaluations directly, she's passionate about supporting organisations to develop robust evaluation and monitoring systems with people with lived experience at the centre. She has her own lived experience of mental ill health, trauma and suicidality. In addition to her evaluation practice, Jo is undertaking a PhD at the University of Melbourne, focused on involving young people with experiences of trauma in research. So thank you very much for bringing your expertise to CMHDARN today, Jo.
Thanks so much, Katie. I might just start by sharing the slides. And of course, I've got 17 screens going, so I can't find where they are. But there we go. So thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to present to you today on using program logic in research and evaluation. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I think it's particularly important in the context of work in the mental health and drug and alcohol settings to recognise the ongoing impacts of colonisation on the health and well-being of Aboriginal people on these lands, and definitely pay my respects to elders past and present, and their ongoing contribution and community strengths that can contribute to improved health and well-being. So a little bit about what we'll talk about today, and hopefully this is not too surprising to you because it's what went out in the information about the session. But we're going to be talking about what program logic and theory of change are, how you use program logic and theory of change, and how are program logic and evaluation linked. I guess for the sake of time and just the kind of natural language that I slip into, I'll be using evaluation a lot in what I talk about here, and particularly about the application of program logic to evaluation. I'm not too precious about the distinction between research and evaluation, and I think the kind of principles of what we're talking about apply broadly across research or evaluation. Before we go any further, I think topics around program logic, theory of change, they can often seem quite abstract. And so it might be helpful as we go through this and we think about what these concepts look like to have a project in mind, one that you're working on, or one that you're potentially designing, evaluating. Just so that when we talk through the various concepts and the bits of a program logic, while I'll have some examples there, sometimes it's useful to think about how this ties into what you're doing in your own practice and to make it a bit more real. But let's get into it. So first of all, what is a theory of change? So at its most basic level, theory of change explains a story of what you're trying to do with a program or a project or any kind of intervention. And it's at its most basic, it's why what you do will lead to an outcome that you're trying to achieve. So if I do this, then this thing results, and that leads to these long-term outcomes. I really like this cartoon by Chris Lysey, who does a lot of cartoons to help explain evaluation concepts. And he basically uses the example of a theory of change for making a cup of coffee. And so the input is that you make a cup of coffee. The activity might be drinking the cup of coffee. And so the output that you've then had from that process of making the coffee is having a sip of that coffee. And then it comes to the outcomes. And in this case, it's somebody who likes coffee. And so the theory of change for that person is if you make and drink a cup of coffee, then the outcome that you're going to get is yum. That was delicious. But I think this is also helpful for thinking about what other theories of change might be. So if you've got somebody, for example, who coffee gives them an upset stomach, then the theory of change might be you make a cup of coffee, you drink a cup of coffee, and then you don't feel so good afterwards. So the theory of change is basically how do we tell the story simply of what a program is trying to do. Now, obviously, the programs that you're working with are going to be a lot more complex than drinking a cup of coffee, but I think we can always bring it back to that very simple model of what we're trying to talk about. So why develop a theory of change? There's lots of points at which developing a theory of change is a particularly helpful thing to do. And obviously today we're going to focus on evaluation and research, but it's probably worth mentioning that they're helpful at various stages of the process as well. And you may well have used them in various parts of your practice before. So developing a theory of change is really helpful when you're designing a program. So thinking through what are we trying to do and how are we going to achieve that? What activities do we want to deliver in order to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve? They're really helpful in implementation. So how are we going to do that? Do we have particular assumptions about what we're trying to do and things that we need to deliver in order for outcomes to happen? And then finally, at the evaluation stage, they're really helpful for determining if you've achieved what you're trying to do. I'll just take some water. Developing a theory of change is helpful for a bunch of reasons. And I think we often get stuck on thinking about the output of the theory of change as the most helpful bit of that. So I'll talk a little bit in a second about how there are different kinds of theory of change, of which program logic is one of them. But when we think about the output of a theory of change development process, we tend to think of the kind of one-page diagram that summarizes neatly what your program's trying to do and the intent that you have for that. But I think it's also really helpful to think of developing a theory of change as a process as well, where you have to come together and think, discuss, and collaborate. And the best value that you'll get in developing a theory of change is not just when one person goes away and documents how they think a program works, but when you bring a bunch of different stakeholders together, it might be frontline workers, it might be managers, executives, get them all together in a room and talking about how they understand a program to work, to be able to document that collectively. What that process often does is throw up where people think differently about aspects of the theory of change on the bits where people are all on the same page. And so it gives you an opportunity to actually talk through what some of those different understandings might be about how the program's working so that you can come to a shared agreement and shared expectations about what a program's doing. So again, throughout this session today, I encourage you to be thinking of program logic and theory of change, not just as a tool that you get at the end, but a process that can be really helpful to do throughout an evaluation. And I'll mention as well that it's not a static thing, and you should be considering coming back to your theory of change and thinking about if there are things that you need to tweak or improve based on new information that you're learning. So why would you develop, or when would you develop a theory of change? So the first one there is pretty obvious. If you don't have a theory of change, it's a good idea to think about developing one. Or if there are gaps in the one that you've got, so it might be that you have a theory of change for a core program that you developed, like a training package, for example, and then you decide to offer that training package slightly tweaked to a different audience. Do you need to then revisit your theory of change and think about if that applies, if the core package that you have works in the same way if you're delivering it, say, in an Aboriginal community to that audience? It's also important to think about your theory of change if your understanding of how a program works has changed over time. So it might be if you started a program up 5 years ago and you had a clear vision of how it's going to work, but then over time the context has changed, which is the next point there, or funding has changed, or as with the example before, you've added a different component into the theory of change. So really just anything about that context that's changed, thinking about redeveloping the program logic. It might also be that when you originally designed the theory of change, you had a particular understanding about how people might engage with the program. And then once you've actually rolled it out, you discover that actually people don't want to engage in that way, or when they do, it leads to a different result. So constantly being mindful of the different things that have changed in that setting that you might want to go back and change your theory of change. And then finally, that one there goes to that point that I was talking about before about the process and the bringing everyone together. Sometimes you might have disagreement between different stakeholders involved in your program about how valid the current theory of change is. And so in that case, that would be one where that process of bringing people together is a really important part of the process, because it gives people an opportunity to talk about where those disagreements might be lying and why those disagreements are there. Is it because it actually, people do just hold a different philosophical approach to the program, or is there a gap in information that one group of people don't understand a particular aspect about how the program works? So it's a good chance to bring people together and share those ideas. As I mentioned before, program logic is just one tool for talking about theory of change. It's probably the most common one that you'll come across, and it's certainly the one that in things like grant applications or funding agreements, you often are required to provide program logic that explains how your receipt of that funding is going to translate to the outcomes that you want to use. It's very well understood in kind of program and policy development land, so it's often an expectation that you would develop a program logic there. But I think, it's worth mentioning that it is just one tool for developing a theory of change, and you might want to use a different tool. I think many of them have similarities in common to program logic. So investment logic, for example, that's used very heavily in Victorian government departments because it's really focused on how does the particular spending that's being invested in this program translate to outcomes, and particularly from that kind of value for money, efficiency lens of an investment. And there's also more narrative theories of change, which is a bit more like the drawing that I had at the start, where you would have a more storified version of what you're saying, and simplifying it to simply have a narrative description that says, if we do X, Y, Z, then we achieve X, Y, Z, which leads to XYZ outcomes. So rather than having it as a single diagram, you're literally telling the story with words about what your theory of change is. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that program logic itself comes in numerous formats, some of which you might be more familiar with. There's a bunch of different ways that these can get documented, but I guess the most common ones are a left to right program logic, which is the model that I'm going to focus on in the rest of the session today. But you also get up and down program logics too. Essentially, they're not actually that different. It's a formatting thing. The contents of the boxes are still broadly the same, but it's just about how you lay those boxes out on the page. You also get other program logics that, theories of change that don't follow that linear structure at all. So things like you might have come across behavior change wheels that are more ecological models, which are more in those cases literally circular and show how theories of change are nested and how different things are interdependent. They're essentially all different diagrammatic tools for doing that process of sharing a story that you want to share. But yeah, we're going to focus on program logic today, probably because it's the most used of the theory of change tools, but also if you're new to the concept, it's a reasonably easy one to grapple with and can be really particularly handy in an evaluation and research context. So I'll give you a second just to have a look at that diagram because there's a fair bit going on there. And as I note in the top, different organizations use different templates. They might have different names for the boxes. Something that I've increasingly done is rather than using those labels of inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes, which are really jargony, but I'll explain what they mean, instead having labels that are much more logically linked to what that box is trying to say. So something like inputs, like what we use, activities, what we do, outputs, what we get, outcomes, what we hope to see change, which is essentially what those are trying to get to. And yeah, the boxes might also be in different kind of layouts, but we'll talk through what each of these component parts look like in a bit more detail. But broadly speaking, what a program logic aims to do is talk about the inputs, so the resources that are available for the delivery of a program or project, the activities, what you then do with those resources that you have, the outputs, which are, I like to think of them as the things that can be counted from what you've done, and the outcomes are then the changes that you hope to see as a result of that. The assumptions in this particular diagram are kind of nested there under inputs and activities, but often the assumptions flow under the whole diagram. So it's in order for all of this stuff to happen, what are the things that we assume need to happen? Another one that you'll also sometimes see in diagrams like this is external factors. So what are the things that are entirely out of our control that might impact how a project operates? So one that's been really common in a lot of program logics that I've worked on over the last 3 years has been COVID-19. Like that's completely out of our control, but might have some significant impacts on the effectiveness of our project or the ability to deliver certain aspects of our project. So I'll talk through each of these boxes in a bit more detail there. So assumptions is essentially what must exist or be done in order for your program logic to happen. So there's some examples there of things that must be in place, and it's the kind of the prerequisites to make sure that your program works. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, that the assumptions can also be things that can be tested in the evaluation. So you might include something as an assumption, not being 100% sure if it's actually true, not being 100% sure if it is a prerequisite, if it is something that needs to be there in order for your program to succeed. But you can check that through the process of evaluation. Inputs and activities. Sometimes they're separated, but they're, in my mind, they're kind of come together as this similar kind of concept in terms of the purpose that they serve in a program logic. So the inputs is essentially what did you use to enable you to do things through this program. So sometimes there'll be really tangible things that are easy to count. So it'll be funding, money, workforce, and so the actual physical resources that enabled a project to happen. But it's also important to recognize that sometimes there's more intangible things as well. So it might be that there's a policy environment that needs to exist in order for your program to exist, or partnerships that rely on relationships with people that it's much harder to pin down exactly what it is that is the clear input, but you know that there's something there that needs to happen in order to input into your program success. Activities are then what you did. And that's usually the easiest one to put into any program logic, because that's the thing that's in the project plan. That's the thing that everyone knows that they're doing. And so it's often things like delivering services, delivering training, developing resources. But when you're developing your theory of change, it can also be helpful to think about what some of those other activities are that you might need to have in place in order for a program to be successful, that are not the kind of big headlines that your program is delivering. I'm going to focus a little bit on outputs versus outcomes now, because this is one that often stumps people. So outputs are, I think of them as the flip side to activities. So if you've done something, what are the things that you can tangibly count as a result of having done those things? What can you see has happened as a result of the activities that you've done? So it might be the number of clients that you've provided a service to. It might be the number of groups that you've run. It might be the number of training sessions that you've delivered. It might be that a resource was developed. So they're things that you can very clearly say, we have done this as a result of this program. Outcomes is the much more interesting bit for research and evaluation. It's what happened as a result of what you did, what changed, what improvements have been made, and sometimes, I'll talk about this a bit later, what didn't we anticipate was going to happen that's happened. So that's when you get those less tangible things that you would still want to see from a program. So awareness increased, well-being improved, knowledge increased. Now, obviously, all of those things are measurable, but they're not easily measured by just counting the number of things that you did. And sometimes the way that you measure them would be a more qualitative discussion of how did you feel after having done this program, rather than just a pure kind of numerical count. It's really tempting for people to focus on outputs rather than outcomes, because outputs are the things that prove that you did the work. And so people want to, in evaluations, go, but we delivered 30 training sessions. And as an evaluator, I always go, well, that's lovely, but did those 30 training sessions actually change anything? And that's where the outcomes bit becomes really important. In a program logic, you'll also often see that outcomes are split over different timeframes, and that recognizes that outcomes do some of outcomes do take longer to emerge and to become more apparent. And so there are things that you can see that happen in the short term, but other things might take longer and might have other inputs in order for them to happen. Often also outcomes will build on each other. So you need to have something happen in the short term in order for a medium term outcome to emerge. The other thing that this allows you to do by really clearly documenting short, medium, long term is to see usually outcomes that happen in the longer term are going to rely on things that aren't just within the purview of your program, and that might be dependent on other things happening in the social context or the policy context in which you're delivering a program. And so by organizing short, medium, long outcomes, it allows you to really clearly document that logic of what you're doing, and show that even if we haven't fully contributed to the long-term outcome, we can show that through what we've done in the short and the medium term, we're heading in the right direction. It also allows you to do evaluation work that allows you to capture progress towards those long-term outcomes without having to do 5-year evaluations. So you can establish through doing this logical process that if we do A and B, we're likely to see C happening in the longer term. But because we've only got a year to do this evaluation, we can't actually measure C, but we can measure A and B. And if we're seeing A and B happen, based on the logic of what we assume would happen, we suggest that over the long term, C is going to happen. So rather than talk about that in the abstract, I thought it might be helpful to use an example. This is a hypothetical example that I've drawn based on safe injecting rooms, because they're quite topical in Melbourne at the moment. And so what you can see here is that these outcomes are building on each other across time. So in the short term, what you want to do in, say, the first year of a safe injection room being open is that IV drug users are aware of the program and that they access the program. In the medium term, you want to see that people feel safe using that space, and you might see that by people coming back repeatedly, or saying that they feel safe in that space. And another medium outcome in that case might be that the users start to engage in drug treatment. Over the long term, what that might lead to is a reduction in overdose deaths, a reduction in bloodborne viruses, and a reduction in harmful drug use. The reason it's really helpful to step these out is you can see how each of those outcomes will build on one another, but also it avoids the temptation that often when you are thinking about what a program might achieve, you want to jump to the long term and you want to jump to this program is going to change the world, this program is going to help everyone's health and well-being, but it's unlikely that you're going to see that big picture change in the short term. And so again, as I mentioned before, stepping out how you're going to get to that long term is a way of essentially setting up your project not to fail. Because if you're just evaluating those long-term outcomes, have we changed the world? Chances are that no individual program is going to solely be responsible for changing the world, because the world is more complex than that. So if you have these short and medium term outcomes in place, it allows you to hold yourself accountable to things that your program might feasibly actually achieve. So again, I thought it would be helpful to step through an actual example of what a program logic might look like when all of those things are in place. And again, this is a fictional example that I've made up of an audit tool that's designed to support clinical services readiness to engage with peer workers. So in that case, the inputs to that would be the actual tool itself. It would be the workforce that are tasked with implementing that tool, both potentially centrally, whoever's running the project, but also the staff at the clinical services who are doing the audit. And it would be government funding in order for the whole project to happen. The activities that are occurring through that project are training in how to use the audit tool. There's a supporting frequently asked questions document for people to understand how to use the tool in their own practice. Then there's the actual rollout and delivery of the audit tool. And there's also an email support contact for people to get in touch with if they need more help doing the audit tool. As I say, I've made all of this up in terms of what it actually looks like. The outputs that come through that, remember, those are the things that you can really clearly count that have happened as a result of what you've implemented. So it's the services that have commenced using the audit tool. It's the number of audits completed, the number of training sessions delivered, the number of time documents were accessed, and the number of support requests. So what you can see from those outputs there is that, yes, they give you some indication of how much a tool has been engaged with, but it doesn't actually tell you anything about whether the tool was implemented well, whether it's led to any change in culture, or any of the things that are then captured in the outcomes. So the outcomes that are split over different timeframes are that services are engaged in assessing their readiness, that they understand what readiness looks like, and that they consider the readiness factors in their own workforce. In the medium term, they understand the gaps in their readiness and they implement approaches to address that. And then in the long term, you see that that enables peer workers to be integrated into clinical services and for consumers to have opportunities to be able to interact with peer workers. And then there's some assumptions under that. Do we have enough resources to implement the program? Clinical services, do they actually want to engage with doing an audit of this kind? And finally, do peer workers actually deliver improved outcomes for consumers? And so are we going to see those long-term outcomes happening even if we do all of this stuff? Another thing that I should say on short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes is that it's in your hands what timeframes you set for those. So really think about what applies sensibly to your program. It might be if you're doing a training session that runs over one day, the short-term outcome might be that one day. So what do people leave the training session with? The medium-term outcome might be 3 months of doing the training when they start to implement practice, and the long term might be, has this led to sustainable culture change where they've implemented the training? So in that case, the short, medium, and long could all happen within 6 months, say, and is tailored to what you have the scope for in your evaluation. But you might also have projects where those long-term outcomes aren't going to happen in less than 10 years. And so I'm working on program logic at the moment with a government agency where they're trying to achieve long-term culture change within their workforce so that it's a safe place to work. With all the will in the world, it's going to take longer than a couple of months for that to become a fully safe place to work. And so the long-term outcomes in that program logic that we've designed are things that happen over 10 years. And so that again points to why it's helpful to have those short and medium term outcomes there, because it's not always possible to just wait 10 years and then measure it 10 years to see if you've achieved the long term. And also it's not that helpful because you want to be learning and adapting along the way, on the way to the 10 years. And so having those short and medium term outcomes that you can measure on that journey to long term is really important too. I've just seen a question in the chat as well, in the Q&A about whether program logic is most beneficial for teams that do training programs or projects. That's an example that I often just come back to because it's an easy one for everyone to kind of understand. Everyone's been to training, everyone knows the purpose of training and what it's trying to achieve. But I think program logic, or at least a theory of change model, is probably relevant to any kind of program that you're wanting to undertake. So for example, I've just developed another program logic that is for an integrated service model. And the program logic is designed to specifically outline how integration is going to happen between different agencies that are bringing that together. So in the short term, some of the outcomes that are there are whether the teams know each other, whether they want to be between each other or be with each other and work together on things. The medium term is that they are actually working together and doing integrated practice. And the long term is that integrated practice is leading to better outcomes for consumers. So basically, you can take this model and you can apply it to, I would say, most programs that would be delivered by the kinds of organizations that are on this call today. I will keep talking about training programs because they kind of are an easily accessible example, but there's lots of different applications that you can use for something like this. So things to remember when designing a program logic. So link it to your plan for outcomes. It's not just a project plan. Evaluation comes later. So when you're initially designing your program logic, don't get too bogged down in thinking, is this something that we can actually measure? Have it in there, and then you'll use it, as I'll talk about in a second, as a tool for thinking about how you measure it down the future. And also keep it high level. It's not a client journey map. You're not trying to find every individual person's way of engaging with the program that you might be documenting. It really is trying to capture things at that high strategic level. It's important, I think, to mention that there's a few limitations of using program logic. So the first one that I'd mention is it isn't great at capturing complexity. So when you've got lots of things that are interlinked and together are leading to the creation of outcomes, it can be quite messy to work out what fits where, how you're going to group different things. Sometimes something might be both an activity and an outcome. So if you do something, it leads to this outcome, but then that itself becomes an activity. It's kind of hard to explain in the abstract, but sometimes it's hard to work out what fits in what box because things naturally don't fit into boxes. That's fine. I think I'll just always remember when you're doing program logic that it is just a tool and it isn't something that's fully going to capture the complexity of everything that you're doing. So if you view it as this is a tool that's helpful rather than this is going to solve all of our problems, then I think that limitation can be managed. I mentioned there a little bit, it's sometimes challenging to pick up when activities and outcomes are cyclical. So when you need something in order for an outcome to happen, and then that needs to happen again for the next outcome to happen, it's not great at capturing where things kind of loop back because it does follow that linear structure. It's not great at accounting for when the context changes unless you redevelop the program logic or do the exercise again. And it's also not great at accounting for unintended outcomes, which when we come to talk about evaluation in a second, you need to make sure that in addition to testing what's in your program logic, you're also providing a way to capture anything that you didn't expect to happen as a result of the program. For most of these limitations, I think they can be in some way be addressed by updating your program logic as you learn more. So don't be wedded to a diagram that you've developed, because then it just becomes something that you kind of, I'm sure as we've all done, go, well, that was a nice document at the time that we developed it, but everything's changed since then, so we'll just ignore the document. Actually go back to the document and redevelop that so that it still continues to be useful. So for the last little bit, I'm going to talk about how you use program logic in evaluation. So the first one is thinking about developing key evaluation questions. So you can use the program logic to think about what aspects of that process you want to test, and therefore what kind of evaluation you need to do. So if you are really interested in developing a program and doing a developmental evaluation and implementing something and testing it as you go, the assumptions can be a really helpful thing to focus on in your program logic, because you're trying to understand if what you're doing is addressing the situation that you're dealing with. So I've just developed a program logic for a new initiative that's come out of the Royal Commission in Victoria, and that program logic has very much been focused on the assumptions of how that program is going to be implemented. So the kind of principles that they're going to follow around how they do things. So are we implementing, they assume that the program is going to be delivered in a collaborative way. They assume the program is going to be delivered in an evidence-based way. And so then what you do in the developmental evaluation is test, is this actually being delivered collaboratively? Are the things that are being done actually evidence-based? So you can really focus in then on testing the assumptions that you've got in your program logic. If you're wanting to do a process evaluation, then you can really focus in on the activities and outputs bit of the program logic. So thinking basically, did we implement what we said we would and when? And are the activities that we're implementing evidence-based? And so that then allows you to test the kind of processy, are we doing what we expect to be doing? And then finally, you can use it if you want to do an outcomes evaluation to think about what outcomes are that you want to measure, because you've clearly documented them from the outset. I think, as I've mentioned before, and I think I'll probably say again, often the temptation when you're doing an evaluation is to just jump to what it is that you can measure. And in doing that, you miss a lot of the potential to actually think about what it is that you genuinely want your program to achieve, because sometimes the things that you want your program to achieve might not be things that you have easy measures for. And so if you've done that process of kind of accounting for what outcomes do we want to see, then you know the things that you need to develop measures for, rather than kind of just jumping to what data you have available. So this is a bit tied into this one here. So you can work out what outcomes matter, which, as I mentioned before, is different from what evidence do we have. And as I also mentioned before, it's different from what did we do. So often people want to demonstrate in an evaluation that they did lots of stuff, because naturally that's the things that take up their time and energy and focus. But as an evaluator, as a researcher, what you really want to be focused on is, did all that activity actually result in change? Documenting the outcomes like that in a kind of ordered, structured way through program logic also allows you to ask which outcomes matter most, which outcomes happen when, so what happens in the short, medium, and long term, and then are our expectations realistic and feasible? So going back to what I was saying before, it's unrealistic that in 3 months your program's going to be able to change the world. Are there actually outcomes that are realistic in 3 months, and can we measure those and show how our progress is working towards changing the world? It's also really helpful for that process of kind of a data stock take at the start of an evaluation for working out where you don't collect data. So you can, again, this is something I've just done recently with the government agency I mentioned before. Having developed a program logic, we're now literally going through each of their databases and going, which indicators do we have in the databases that match with the outcomes that we've got in the program logic, and where are the gaps? What are things that we don't collect data on? And for those things, what evidence would we need in order to be able to demonstrate an outcome for that? So one of the gaps that identified was that they don't currently have any data on leadership buy-in to the well-being. And so what would we actually need in order to develop, to identify whether leadership have bought into this process. And so as a result, we've developed a rubric that's allowed us to assess whether leaders have bought into the concept that's being evaluated. We were only able to do that because we were able to match the outcomes that we wanted to see to the data that we currently had. And that's me reached the end. I think I'll stop talking now, and maybe I think Katie will come back and we'll have some questions.
Hi, so thank you so much, Joe. I've already learned so much more than I had known about program logic, and everyone, please, if you have any burning questions, if you're thinking about using program logic and you want some guidance, maybe this is a good opportunity to utilize Jo and her great expertise. Maybe I'll start by, we're talking a fair bit about assumptions and maybe kind of the real purpose around them, and kind of delving into that a bit more, I think is really interesting.
Yeah. So the purpose of the assumptions is, I guess, to recognize that program logic is just a kind of artificial 2D tool for something that's actually quite complex. And so the assumptions, it's a little bit of a get out of jail free card when you're doing a program logic of going, for all of these things to happen, we need that assumption to be true. So there is that kind of cynical view of looking at what it is, but it is also quite helpful for you to, when you're developing it and before you're doing the evaluation, think about, are there any things that we particularly need to research or ask in our evaluation to understand why we haven't achieved an outcome? So if we haven't achieved an outcome from a program, is that, for example, because if one of the assumptions of the program is that it's adequately resourced, has the program not achieved an outcome because something about the way the program has been delivered is flawed and it isn't evidence-based, and the services that have been delivered are bad? Or is the flaw and the reason that it's not achieved the outcome because it actually hasn't been adequately funded and there aren't enough people to do the job that we're expecting the research to do? So it allows you to pinpoint where is the logic breaking down and why isn't a program maybe living up to its expectations if it isn't living up to its expectations.
Interesting. It seems kind of like a nice way of really critically reflecting where you're at, and a really, interesting space, I guess, for teams to really come together and think about the context of everything.
Yeah, I think people often want to jump into let's talk about what we're doing, let's get stuff done. But I'd always say just pause and stop. And it's the same when it comes to something like survey design. People want to jump into going, we've delivered this program, we want to do a survey to understand if the program's working. And I always go, whoa, hang on a second. What is it that you want to assess through doing the survey? And the way that you do that is by doing something like a program logic that goes, well, these are all the outcomes that we want to see. And now we've developed the program logic. Developing the survey is really easy because we just turn everything that we've got as an outcome into a question that we put in the survey. And so then you don't get to the end of a process of an evaluation and go, actually, it would have been really good to find out if people felt safe participating in this program. But you haven't collected any of the data on that because you didn't think up front that whether people felt safe was something that mattered to capture.
Yeah. And I guess I'm curious about the kind of collaborative side of developing program logic. Have you seen any examples of really honing in on collaborating with service users in developing, or looking at past program logic and then kind of evaluating, or and even making it a co-design or co-production effort?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a core part of the way that I like to do things, is to have service users or program participants or whatever your context is involved in designing that program logic upfront. So I did one for a project in Queensland that was about consumer participation in a project. And so we really wanted to, the thing that we were evaluating was consumer participation. So we also wanted to do the project in the spirit of involving consumers in that project. And so we got everyone together and initially just kind of brainstormed, what is it that you would want this program to deliver? And at that point, the program had been operating for 8 months. So it was kind of a blue sky. Imagine that the program hasn't been working. What would you, or hasn't been operational? What would you want it to do? And then we documented some of the outcomes that we would want the program to do. And then had another workshop where we iterated them in that kind of participatory way of doing things. And so that the program logic that resulted from that was very much designed in partnership between the program, its senior stakeholders and decision makers, and people who the program aimed to support. So yeah, I'd really encourage you to have as many people who the program logic is about involved in the process of developing it.
Yeah, because I guess it's all well and good deciding outcomes for people, and also I guess for the workers of the program, deciding the activities that they have to and what they're hoping to achieve. So getting that real collaborative work seems like just makes it more meaningful, I guess, and maybe greater ability to get to those outcomes and change the world, as you were as you put it.
Yeah.
I think there's a question. So are there any templates or online resources to help with starting program logic use?
Yes, there are. And as you might have seen by what was on the slide before I closed it, I did link to some resources in the slides, which I think Katie's very kindly going to send out to you all. So you'll have those links. One tip that I have for you is that there's a website called Better Evaluation. That is, even though I've been a professional evaluator for more than 10 years, I still probably check that website every fortnight. Because it is just like the Bible on how to do evaluation. And so there's some really great resources in there on theory of change, developing program logic. And so that's always my number one go-to, but we'll send around the slides that have got a few more resources as well. The other thing I'd add is most big government departments also have tools for doing program logic. And actually in New South Wales, the Department of Education has developed some really great resources for thinking about program logic. And so I recommend, again, if you, we'll include them in the resources, but if you just search Department of Education program logic, you'll get some good stuff.
Yeah, and CMHDARN last year developed a kind of very easy guide to program logic, and so I've just popped that in the chat as well if anybody is interested, and it's got also links to other resources and helpful examples in there as well. And I think it helps kind of second the idea that there's no kind of one way to do it, and which I think is fun, particularly if you are going down that co-design route. You can go with what works with the service users or the people that you're in the room with, which I think is a really awesome way to approach it. Jo, what do you think is the biggest benefit in research and evaluation? Like, why, in terms of people walking away today feeling motivated and saying, yes, we're going to do it? Why? What is the kind of number one benefit, do you think?
I think it's kind of in the name of program logic. Like, I think it's about thinking logically about what you're trying to do. And then that flows on to what you need to plan to do an evaluation well, the questions that you want to ask, the resources that you're going to need, the data that you're going to need. It's very hard to think about where you would start in an evaluation without fully understanding the program that you're trying to evaluate. And so program logic is a really helpful tool for just at the start going, okay, this is the lay of the land, this is what we're trying to understand, and then using that as your logical starting point for working through what you need to do in evaluation. It might be that you do that and then there are points that you deviate from the program logic, or you know, as you're going through the evaluation, there's some area of unintended outcomes that emerges that you hadn't accounted for in the program logic. And that's fine, follow those rabbit holes, but have a plan to start with, the logic to start with, and it allows you to still have that anchor point to come back to, even when you follow things in different directions.
Thank you. And maybe I know that I learn best by hearing examples, and you obviously have so much experience. Maybe you could give an example that would be applicable to much of the CMHDARN membership, which is mental health and drug and alcohol in that kind of NGO space. Is there something like maybe you could give an example of something that you've seen or that you think would be typical in that space, and kind of talk through the process maybe?
Yeah. So I think I actually developed a program logic with the Mental Health Coordinating Council a couple of years ago for an NDIS program, or it was to support NDIS practitioners to improve their compliance with the behaviour standards that are, and apologies, it's been like 3 years since I thought about the project, so the language might not be quite right. But it was and I'm going to annoy whoever asked the question about training, but it was a training program. And what using that logic approach enabled us to do was to work out how you would actually step through the likelihood of outcomes emerging from doing training. And so in the first kind of level, you have outcomes that are related to how do people engage with the training, did they leave feeling like they'd learned something? And that's really helpful because often when you do like a post-training survey, the questions are all like, was the trainer good? Was this engaging? Did you like the lunch? And all of that's really helpful information, but it doesn't actually tell you anything about whether somebody's practice changed when they went back to their workplace. And so in the next stage of the program logic, what we were able to then think about was, okay, if somebody's been along to the training and they've engaged with it and they listened to what the trainer did and they left feeling motivated, did they then learn anything different from what they knew before they went in? And did they then have opportunities to put that into practice? And so then that's one of the assumptions that we really wanted to test in that evaluation was, if people go along to training, do they then have the opportunity to actually learn, like put into practice what they've learned? Or is, I'm sure we've all been in workplaces where we're the one person who's gone to the training and we leave and we're invigorated, and then we come back into our workplace where everyone just wants to do business as usual and there's no chance to put into practice what you've learned. So we were able to break it down into those kind of different levels of how likely change would occur. We're then able to do some of the short-term surveys that you might usually associate with training. So we did have a immediately post-webinar survey on, did you learn anything? Do you intend to do anything different? But then we were able to have a follow-up survey a few months later that basically tested those longer-term outcomes of, were you able to implement this in practice, and what got in the way of you being able to do that, and what made it easier to implement in practice? And that then enabled that to be fed back into the program to make sure that people were able to actually put into practice what they had learned. Yeah. One of the things about program logic is that it's very diagram based. So it's hard to sometimes explain things in abstract. And I'm aware that my hands are doing this because I'm like, there's a box here, there's a box there. But yeah.
No, it's so helpful, and I think I think everyone is very aware of that idea of just focusing on those short term, or they're just doing the ticker box because they've been funded to do something, and then not looking at those outcomes and just focusing on outputs. And so I think it just helps structure, particularly in programs, to help have those grander ideas kind of at the forefront and at the center of why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, if we don't have any questions, maybe I'll look at giving everyone a nice 5-minute early mark. So thank you, everyone. Thank you particularly to Jo Farmer for her fantastic presentation, and for everyone who participated today. The webinar will be up on the CMHDARN website in a few days, and I've we'll pop in the chat. Here we are. A link to a short survey just to let us know what you think of today's session. But thank you all very much, and thank you again, Jo, and we look forward to the next CMHDARN webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Katie.